I'd like to ask you, you experienced a pretty nasty example of the left cannibalizing one of its own. Do you think the constant internal bickering amongst today's left is a consequence of the class makeup of this left and, frankly, their lack of skin in the game? Meaning that for many of the left, this is a cerebral exercise as opposed to life and death politics, as it was with the working class left we had in the early 20th century.
It's a thoughtful question. I think it's a piece of it, to the extent there is a segment of the left that we would perhaps describe as privileged. Now, that's a word that's been used in the recent context and lent itself to any number of debates, right? And I don't think that does describe the left. In my mind, the left are the workers at Amazon who were struggling to form a union. You know, the left is the people in the street responding to the murders of our neighbors. You know, the left are undocumented dreamers, classmates and friends and students who are trying to maintain a foothold in the country and gain access to a pathway to citizenship. I don't think the left are the hyper-resourced or privileged or loud voices. You know, I don't think Brooklyn Dad is the left, for instance, you know.
Well, I mean, Brooklyn Dad would be a liberal, but the thing is, though, we do have an echo chamber of a chattering class of quote-unquote people who consider themselves leftist, socialist, DSA, imperialist, or progressive, whatever the your term of what you want to choose, so be it, is, who consider themselves left of the traditional Democratic Party. And that constellation is fairly well occupied by highly educationally pedigreed, professional adjacent type individuals. And
Sure.
they tend to congregate around a certain kind of discourse in certain spaces. And my question to you is that reality in and of itself to a more practical politics that doesn't get sucked into internet bullshit, if you to use a direct phrase?
Absolutely, no question there. And it's the difference between a politics that is focused on critique and a politics that is focused on building. And it's easy to critique, right? I mean, you can critique all day, but critique doesn't frankly move us anymore.
Damn.
And a politics that is focused on building bridges, making connections, organizing. You know, I've been organizing for 20 years, and you know, the smears that targeted me knocked me back 2 years at the end of the day, but they didn't knock me out. And that's because the left, actually, like the real left, the grassroots left, stuck by me, right? The privileged left, the chattering class, as you described it, you know, they promote virtue signaling as a more beguiling, easier, more visible, and ultimately completely meaningless, ephemeral alternative to movement building. And I'm not a virtue signaler, I am a movement builder. And I do think that what you're describing is a fetish for policing a movement as distinct from expanding it. And you know, part of this we have to root in neoliberalism, because the very the idea of identity politics as a locus around which to build coalitions is a neoliberal contrivance invented effectively to destroy the left. And because there were points when, you know, Fred Hampton was killed for this, when people organized across communities. I, as an organizer, have organized across communities for 20 years. That's what makes me dangerous, and they only smear you if they fear you. And frankly, the establishment has lots of reasons to fear me and the people who support us all here. You know, we have the wind at our backs in the context of a generation that's been radicalized. And this is maybe the last point I make here in terms of who is the left. I don't think of the left as the vanguard. I think of the left as the people under the boot. And generationally, that's increasingly everyone. And that, in my mind, makes the transition, the paradigm shift, inexorable, inevitable. It's precisely also what incentivizes these kinds of attacks, because the inclination to police a movement only emerges when there's a perception of something there to fight over, when there's turf to be fought over. And you know, when you're building turf, you're not as inclined to fight over it, right? Like I'm not trying to slice up a pie, I'm trying to build it. And you know, people who are maybe who have different intentions, let's just put it that way to be charitable, might approach the game very differently. And I absolutely agree with you that it's an obstacle. And at the end of the day, all we can do is continue to build bridges, ideally anticipate these kinds of identity-based attacks. And the key I would want to offer here is insist upon time, patience, investigation, and due process before leaping to conclusions when activists and candidates of color are accused of predictable offenses.
Doug?
Yeah.
I think it was you. I don't want to say you said this, and I don't want to put this on you, but Doug Lain, Shahid, I don't know if you know Doug's work. I don't want to. I'm just putting the words in Doug's mouth, and that'll be the quote. Well, Doug said all black people. So Doug responds to people's comments, not all the time, but if it really gets to him, he'll respond, which is interesting to me. And I don't know if it was Doug that said this, or maybe it was Varn that said it, but it was somebody, I want to say in the Zero Books family, that said it's a lot. The online left is a lot of liberals cosplaying as communists. Was that you, D, or was that somebody else?
I said something kind of like that, I think, on Facebook.
Yeah, it was Facebook.
Yeah. No. So I think I actually want to question this idea that the left isn't a vanguard, because on the one hand, I can see why you would want to distance yourself from that kind of language. But as someone who's trying to figure out how to be a Marxist, I wonder if we need something like a left vanguard that can think past the impasse we're in. Because my concern about focusing only on organizing is that you end up organizing for the center of the Democratic Party, even when you're successful. And, that what might be needed right now is another kind of party, a socialist party, which would have to have not only a base of mass support in the working class, but also have a different group of people who are leading it. It's hopefully not me, but someone who has developed a thorough and deep critique, not only of capitalism, but also of the last 100 years of socialism or so, that we rethink how we've been handling the perpetual crisis that is the capitalist system, and try to create a new movement and party for radical revolutionary change. And I just think that's such a big task, and we can't just valorize the idea of everyday people who, after all, are by defining them as everyday, you limit them to working within the system as it is. Who knows where the vanguard will come from, but the point is that we do need a different kind of thinking.
I was with you right up until the end when you were talking about the idea of everyday people being inherently sort of limited in how they engage. Because in my mind, when I think of everyday people engaging, I go to Occupy, and we didn't have a leader. It was a leader-full movement. And we certainly weren't organizing within the center of the Democratic Party. We were organizing around visionary demands that, with all due respect to contemporary politics, we were on the right train a decade ago. Like, if anybody listened to us in the institutional establishment 10 years ago, we could have stopped, we could have averted Trump and preempted that whole ball of wax. With the financial sagas of the more recent years could have been avoided. Like, the political culture has come around finally to recognize what we were saying 10 years ago. And in the context of War and Peace in our international empire 20 years ago. And, there's not a lot of solace in being right when your civilization continues to step off cliffs. And so when I think of the leaderful movement led by everyday people, I think of the students, I think of the carpenters, I think of the beauticians, I think of the people, the Air Force colonel who I met at Occupy St. Louis the first day that we launched there. I think of literally everyday people, and the reason why their participation, frankly, is the only kind that matters. And a vanguard, I don't want to say a vanguard is irrelevant. A vanguard matters. I construe myself as having been part of it. But the force that turns the ship of our body politic has to be more than just the people leaning on the rudder. And that's why the participation of everyday people matters. The point here I'd want to make is that building on-ramps to easy participation is critical. That's one of the things that make online activism beguiling. And as more people engage in those easy steps, ultimately at the margins, increasingly meaningless. But I'm a big fan of offline, and the pandemic makes this hard. Hopefully this will get easier soon. Offline, face-to-face, in-person organizing connections and actions. Because in those face-to-face interactions, in between the flashpoints, are moments of interaction, connection, and community building. And when our community builds in the context of our expressive participation, that's a regenerative exercise. It builds on itself. It feeds on itself. When we formed the artist collectives in Palo Alto and San Francisco and Washington, D.C. that have been speaking truth to power for 20 years, that's how we did it. And that's a micro version of what I hope to happen at a more macro scale. But one place where I really want to come back to what Doug was saying and draw a circle around it and agree wholeheartedly is the need for challenges to the center outside the establishment. Now, you were talking about a socialist party. I don't even know if it has to be partisan. I frankly think an assertive labor movement that was willing to challenge the Democratic Party and support challengers to it on behalf of its rank and file might be enough. Whether a renewed labor movement or a socialist party or a widespread revival of the Occupy movement, there are a lot of different tactics and strategies in the toolbox, and I'm not in a position to try to deny any of them the opportunity to express themselves. And frankly, I'd like to see them all happen. But I do think especially the assertive consciousness of whether it's the working class, low-income communities of color, undocumented folks, marginalized people speaking up, as we have been doing increasingly in all kinds of different fora, that forces the system to heal. And I see it at the moment reflected symbolically in rhetoric. I could go on, but I'm just yapping. I think we have to make real, and I think we
To hear the rest of this show and more, you can find us at This Is Revolution Podcast, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, Podbean, Pandora, and wherever else you get your podcasts. Also, you can find a new episode every Wednesday on the Zero Books YouTube channel. This is Revolution.